Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Several people sent this to me for obvious reasons. 47 Alameda County Sheriff's deputies stripped of their guns after failing psych tests. From the Associated Press, the Alameda County Sheriff's Office in Northern California has stripped 47 deputies, which is 10% of the force, of their guns and their ability to make arrests because they failed psychological exams. That report came out just the other day, and a spokesperson for the department says it was horrible to have to relieve the deputies of their duties. The station obtained a copy of the letter, which was sent to the deputies of their change of status last Friday. The deputies will still receive their pay and benefits. They just don't get to carry the gun anymore or make any arrests. The move came after the sheriff's office conducted an internal audit of deputies' psychological examinations dating back to January of 2016. The letter from the sheriff notified a deputy whose name was blacked out in the copy seen by the news that the deputy had been graded D, as in not suited in a psychological evaluation, and under state law could not serve as a peace officer. It turns out there's standards set by law. Who'd have thought? The letter said the sheriff's office had previously been operating under incorrect advice that had been received several years ago from the California Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training, which said it could hire candidates who received the D rating. The spokesperson said the deputy can be hired if a second examination declares him or her suitable, and the office intends to schedule an appointment for such an exam. So they failed the exam before, they can take it again. And as you know, you can study for a psychological exam and get better results, presumably, right? Our intention is to resolve this issue as quickly as possible. We also intend to have you return to full duty status once you obtain a suitable finding, the letter said. Meanwhile, the sheriff's spokesperson said he hoped that the retests would occur in the next 2 months. The tests will be conducted by a psychologist who does not work directly for the sheriff. Also said the audit followed the arrest earlier this month of a former deputy who was charged with shooting and killing a couple in their California home back in September. Now, that man's mother told a TV station that her son had been in a romantic relationship with one of the people, and he believed that she was unmarried. Not quite sure how that plays into that story, but I guess it makes sense to somebody. The station said 4 sources said the man had failed his psychological exam, although the spokesperson had said previously that the man was hired in September of 2021 and had passed all the psychological tests. So I guess the question simply is, what do you consider to be a passing grade? The Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, an Oakland nonprofit that deals with race and criminal justice issues, accused the sheriff's office of previously turning a blind eye to the problem of unsuited deputies. This further highlights the egregious levels of dysfunction and corruption that have plagued the sheriff's office for years, the center's organizing director said in a statement. Meanwhile, a spokesperson said the department has been under enormous pressure to hire more deputies, and it was hard to find people for the tough job. I know that people are going to assume that all these deputies are killers, but that's not true. The test tries to find out if you are psychologically suitable for the job to handle all the horrible things we see. At the age of 22, sometimes you're not. I know this isn't good, but it's not as bad as it sounds. Well, here somebody is simply stating the obvious. Many people do believe that being a police officer would be a difficult job. I myself believe that also. Not everyone is suited for every job out there. So, if they have criteria and say that you need to meet this criteria to get this job, then they need to test you, and if you meet the criteria, then consider giving you the job. If you don't meet the criteria, that should be the end of the discussion for you, unless somehow later down the road you meet the criteria. But a psychological exam is a little different than, like, say, a proficiency exam, right? So let's suppose that you have to go to the shooting range and hit a target so many times. Your inability to do that might disqualify you from being a peace officer, right? However, obviously, you can go and practice that and get better at it. Also, for instance, I assume there might be written tests where you've got to answer questions regarding the law, right? What are the elements of murder? What are the elements of jaywalking? How do the two differ from each other? What do they got in common? Obviously, you can study for that also. But a psychological exam sounds like something that's designed to weed out certain people. And I'm not sure how much a person can change from time to time, because presumably, if you're being examined by somebody, right, and they know that you're being examined, so they expect someone to be presumably on their best behavior. And if somebody fails that kind of an exam, then it does make you wonder whether they could come back later and pass it, because what has changed since the last time they took the exam? And here's one of the things, and I know that this is not going to be quantifiable. We're not going to put numbers on this in an objective sense, but many people know, and I believe this to be true my entire life based on my own interactions with police officers, is there are certain people who are drawn to certain fields, and we believe, and I know that other people agree with me on this, that there are certain personality types that are drawn to being police officers, some of which are not actually suitable for being police officers. So once in a while, someone who's a bully, for instance, will become a police officer, and I believe it's because they get to wear a badge and a gun and push people around. And I believe there are people out there who are like that. I'm not saying it's all police officers. I'm not. I've spoken to police officers and asked them this, and they roll their eyes and they go, of course. But then they go, Steve, it's kind of like people who like to argue who become attorneys. That's true too. I'll be the first to admit that. For some odd reason, it's not that odd, but I had to preface it with something. There are people out there who like to argue, who go, you know what? I can argue for a living if I become an attorney. And they go through all the trouble of becoming an attorney, and they think it suits them because they like to argue. And some people, I suppose, who do that might become good attorneys. Many of them don't. And I have encountered many attorneys who are unsuited for the job of being an attorney. And likewise, I've met judges who became judges because they liked the idea of being able to push people around and tell them what to do. And so there is something about how certain vocations attract certain types of people. Now, the good news is that California has apparently said, hey, look, we recognize the fact that there are certain people drawn to becoming police officers who shouldn't be police officers. And one way we can weed that out is through a psychological examination. So they have to pass that test to become a police officer, an actual sheriff's deputy. And somehow there were almost 500 police officers in this group, and 47 of them were deemed unsuitable based on their psychological scores, and yet somehow they'd been acting as police officers. And it turns out they weren't allowed to do that. So they had to go in and say these 47 here cannot make arrests, they cannot carry their weapon, and we'll have to move forward and see what happens. So right now they're still all working, they just can't do a couple parts of their job. So we'll see what happens, but the idea that, well, we'll just have them retake the tests. Again, I joked earlier, are they going to study for it? Like, what are you going to do? And I know, some people are going to say, Steve, they're going to go and figure out what it is that they're supposed to look like when they're taking such a test. And, maybe not snap on the examiner who asks a question. They go, what? You can't do that. So we'll see what happens. But it's a shocking headline. And I don't think it surprises that many people that many had failed the test. I think what's going to surprise more people is that the test exists in the first place and that they actually thought of this and were doing this. Now, the fact they're doing it's good, but they weren't enforcing it, which is bad. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, as I like to say. But Caleb, Nathan, Daryl, and Eric all sent it. Thanks a lot. We'll see what happens. But as of right now, 47 Alameda County Sheriff's deputies have been stripped of their guns and their ability to arrest people after failing the psychological tests. The story was published by the Associated Press. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. You can, you should, and if you're brave enough to start, you will.